I don't know how many of you have ever had the frustrating experience of trying to assemble IKEA furniture. And you are sitting there and you're like, I think I've screwed this in as far as it can go, but I don't know. I don't know if I even have the right parts for this. On a show called Whose Line Is It Anyway, one of Drew Carey's favorite things to do is to come up with a list of things that you can say while assembling IKEA furniture that you cannot say to your partner. I'll leave it there. Context matters. Let me give you an example from our biblical text. This morning we read that there are two officers of Pharaoh who are in Pharaoh's prison for wrongs, for slights they have committed, and they both have dreams that they bring to Joseph, and Joseph, the master interpreter of dreams, says, this is what it means. And so first, the cupbearer says, there was a vine in front of me, there were branches, and I squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph says to him, the branches represent 3 days. Be'od shlosh yamim, Joseph says, Yisa Pharaoh et roshecha. Pharaoh will lift up your head, and he will put you back into your place, and you will return to your role. Yisa Pharaoh et roshecha. Pharaoh will lift up your head, he says to the cupbearer. Well, the chief baker, also in Pharaoh's prison, says, this is great. I am going to ask Joseph what my dream means. And Joseph says, I have bad news and bad news. So baker says, I had this dream, and there were baskets of bread, and the birds ate all my bread. Joseph, what does it mean? And Joseph says, well, the same thing I said to the butler. Yisa Pharaoh et roshecha. Pharaoh will lift up your head. Me'alecha. Right off of you. And indeed, that is what happens. So Pharaoh's chief butler has his head raised, and he is returned to his place in Pharaoh's court. And the baker has his head raised to a point where it is no longer contiguous with his neck, and that is the end of his service to Pharaoh. And so there are many times in the Bible, in life, in Drew Carey and Aisha Tyler's Whose Line Is It Anyway, where the context in which we offer a word matters a great deal. And so that question of context has come out this week in a very different way, or perhaps somewhat the same, as earlier this week, the presidents of 3 major universities were called upon to testify about the state of anti-Semitism on college campuses. They were the presidents of MIT, of the University of Pennsylvania, and this other school in Boston that you probably haven't heard of. And so I watched a good chunk of the 5.5 hours of congressional testimony, which is itself a form of torture. And the testimony got testy at times, and one of the member of Congress asked the president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, so at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Stefanik asked at the start of this exchange, and the president of Harvard replies, it can be, depending on the context. So this is not quite that whose line is it anyway? Is this something that means one thing if I say it to my partner, another thing if I say it to assembling IKEA furniture? This is the question of, am I lifting up your head, or am I lifting your head right off your body? And so there are times when being unsure of context is amusing, and there are times when it is not funny at all. In our tradition, the interpretation of dreams was actually a very serious endeavor. So there is a story, there's an extended passage in the tractate Brachot in the Talmud. There was a dream interpreter named Bar Hedya, and he would interpret dreams, but he would interpret the same dream differently for two different people. This is no Yisa et Roshecha, Yisa et Roshcha me'alecha. So both Abaye and Rava had a dream where they saw meat on top of a barrel, and to Abaye he said, your wine will be sweet, the wine in your barrel will be sweet, and everyone will want to buy meat and wine from you. To Rava, another rabbi, he said, this dream means that your wine will spoil, and people will go buy meat in order to dip it in your vinegar. To one, he says, your wine will be great. The other says, your wine will turn to vinegar, and you will be impoverished as a result. So it turns out that Bar Hedya, the key to how he decided how to interpret his dream was how much you paid him for the interpretation. So Abaye paid the higher rate, and Rava did not offer the full compensation. And in dream interpretation, as in so many other things, you get what you pay for. And so yes, in this case, the same word can be used in more than one way, but the consequences are quite real. So there is a debate, there is a certain kind of debate that can only happen on a college campus. Usually it's after 1 a.m., after pizza has been ordered and certain substances have been consumed. So dude, what does this really mean? And so you have debates like that going on colleges' campuses right now. So for example, one of the chants they will hear shouted through megaphones on campuses day and night is, from the river to the sea. So the intention is that from the river to the sea, there shall be no Jews. Now, some of the people chanting this know exactly what they mean. There are plenty of college students at Harvard who do not know what we mean by to the sea because they have never seen a grade that low in their lives. Frankly, a B+ is triggering. Or when one says globalize the intifada, we can debate what that means. Some of the people chanting that think it's a nice slogan. Some of them mean that just as if we are throwing stones and sending suicide bombers to kill Jews in Israel, that should be happening here too. And so that is the problem with saying that it depends on context, because in fact, that relies on a certain blindness to the context that exists right in front of you. And so this is actually where I am disappointed, because I actually had the chance, I was up on campus a little over a month ago, and I had the chance to meet President Gay, and she is a gifted scholar, she is a very decent person, and she issued an apology for her testimony, and she wrote, I got caught up in what had become, at this point, an extended combative exchange about policies and procedures. What I should have had the presence of mind to do in that moment was to return to my guiding truth, which is that calls for violence against our Jewish community, threats to our Jewish students, have no place at Harvard and will never go unchallenged. So unfortunately, that has been the pattern at this particular campus, a botched response followed by an apology. So I have a daughter who is, you used to be able to say that she was a freshman, but now that's offensive, so a first year. And she is witnessing all of this. You can still be sophomoric, don't worry. And the issue is that on college campuses, there has arisen an orthodoxy of oppression, where what is valued is not necessarily merit, not necessarily the abilities that these students bring with them and the strengths that they develop, but rather the key criterion that must be accessed is who comes from a class that has been more oppressed most recently. And so unfortunately, President Gay, well, actually, fortunately, is not someone who actually hates Jews. Because, by the way, there were presidents of Harvard who did that. So there is a house at Harvard still named for a guy named Abbott Lowell, who set up the quota system to make sure that there would be no more than 15% of Harvard would be Jewish. Now, by the time I got there, that system was mostly gone, although the year that I arrived, which was 1990, was actually the first year there had been a master of one of the houses. So Harvard has a house system. It's kind of like Hogwarts. So Eliot House, where I was, is kind of like Slytherin. And the master who had just resigned was one who was still trying to keep Jews out of his house. So this is not that long ago. So I give the president credit, and I think all of the people who testified before Congress and many of those people who are wrestling with how to handle this are people who do not have a bad bone in their body. The question is whether they have any bones in their body. And so you have a situation where you have people who are in power who are caught between values that they hold dear and values of a university, of an academic system that they cannot overcome, that they cannot challenge. And so we are here, we are in a moment where you have 74 members of Congress who signed a letter to these universities saying, if I can quote Joseph, Yisa roshcha me'alecha. Lift up your head right off of you. And so as I watched the testimony, it's not that these folks have a mean or anti-Semitic bone in their bodies. It is that they are missing backbone. And so watching this testimony, I have to say, I would not want to have to testify before Congress. It is a lot of people, some of whom are intelligent, but all of whom are professional arguers trying to trip you up. On the other hand, if you are the president of a major university, that's kind of your job, right? Like if I show up at a funeral and I don't know what to do, shame on me. And so to some extent, right, when I look at that testimony, if I can paraphrase Jerry Seinfeld, I'm not offended as a Jew, I'm offended as a comedian. So here's the thing. We live in a time where there is hatred of Jews rampant on campuses across the country, and some are doing a better job of dealing with that than others. So to some extent, I think it correlates with whether your football team is playing in December or not. But to some extent, it is really about whether the administration is willing to take a stand and make tough choices. Because here's the thing. There is a lot of hate in our society against a lot of people. So when I was at Harvard 30 years ago, it was relatively easy to be Jewish. It was genuinely hard to be Muslim, to be African American, to be Asian, right? So the students who were most serious about their Islamic faith came to Hillel to have dinner because if you observe halal and you can't find halal meat, kosher is sort of the next best thing. Now at Harvard, there are halal lines in many of the dining halls. There is Hillel serves dinner. If you keep kosher, there is a kosher microwave in the dining hall of the dorm named for President Lowell, who kind of tried to help keep the Jews out. So take it there, President Lowell, all the things you can say about IKEA furniture that you can't say about your partner. Let me leave you with this thought, because there are legitimate arguments. Campuses have to be places of political inquiry, and there have to be debates about issues of policy, about who's right and who's wrong, that it is fair and legitimate for students to ask questions. How do we assess the morality of what Hamas did? How do we assess the morality of what Israel did? Those are questions that students and academics have a right to ask, whether or not I agree with their answers. The problem is when you apply those theories to all Jews or to all Muslims, you get off in a different direction. And so one of the presidents said, well, it's only if applied to a particular student. Well, I am sorry. Saying something about all students means you're also saying it about a particular student. So some of you know I am recently lost a lot of weight, which means I'm no longer allowed to be fat-phobic. But I will say this. At Harvard, if you said kill all the Jews, that might be okay. If you said kill all the fat Jews, that would be a problem. Now you're coming before the board. Here's what's unique, I think, about the moment where we are at, where context matters. I think we are at a moment where there is still a lot of hate against a lot of different kinds of people. But I think the issue is that you can't value people based on who hates them. You have to value them based on who they are and what they do. So there's a rule, this is Hanukkah, that the lights of the Hanukkah menorah all have to be at the same height. That you can't start off with one candle higher than another. You can't start off with one candle lower than another. So the challenge is that it is important on college campuses in the world that people are not set back for who they are. That we understand that someone coming from an inner-city school may not have access to the SAT tutoring that someone coming from a prep school in New York or Atlanta might have. That we understand that people from different backgrounds may need support to be at a particular level, but we are not going to lift you to a particular level just because you are in a particular place on the wheel of diversity. That every candle must be stood. Whether candles are lower, they must be raised, but candles cannot be raised beyond the height that they are naturally at. And so the context in which we are in is one in which we must be committed to the fight against racism, whether it's against groups that used to be hated, groups that used to and are currently hated, groups that have yet to be hated. What's important is that in this context, no one should be hated, that there should not be room on campuses or in our world. And I hate that I have to say this and it's like non-obvious to people, that this should be a world where everyone should be able to bring forth the light that they have, where the goal is to shine brighter, not to extinguish the light of someone else. And so I think when that message reaches the places that seek to illuminate the world may actually be a brighter place after all. Shabbat Shalom.